The children were laughing in the biodome garden when the sky still looked safe. That was the thing about Kepler 442b that made people love it so much. The way the light came through the atmosphere like honey dripping through glass, warm and golden and slow. And the way the wind carried the smell of alien flowers that nobody had proper names for yet. So the colonists just called them sun blossoms, and whispered that they smelled like home, even though home was 1,000 light years away. 12,000 people lived on the outpost they called Horizon's Edge, and every single one of them had chosen to be there. Miners who dragged rare ore from deep underground. Scientists who spent their nights staring at stars nobody had catalogued. Teachers who ran school pods for the colony's children. And families who had packed their entire lives into cargo containers and crossed the black ocean of space because they believed in something bigger than themselves. Vasquez stood at the observation window of the Garrison Command Center and watched the colony breathe. She had been stationed here for 3 years now, and she had come to think of these people as hers. Not in any official way, but in the way a shepherd thinks of a flock. She would lay down her life for any one of them, and she would not even hesitate. She was a hard woman, forged in the fire of Earth's unification wars, where nations that had pointed weapons at each other for centuries finally turned those weapons into plowshares and built something worth protecting. Her face carried scars from those days, and her eyes carried something heavier. But when she watched the kids chase each other through the garden rows, she almost smiled. Down in the research wing, Dr. Oren Bakshi was not smiling at all. He sat in front of his console with his fingers frozen above the keys, and his heart beating too fast. The subspace array had picked up something strange 3 hours ago, had spent every minute since then trying to convince himself he was wrong, but the data would not let him. Fleet mobilization patterns, hundreds of energy signatures, clustering in a system only 2 jumps away, the kind of organized movement that meant warships were gathering, and the kind of silence around it that meant someone did not want to be noticed. He pulled up the signature profiles and matched them against the database, and his stomach turned cold when the result came back. Velkari, every single one of them. The Velkari hegemony was an insectoid civilization that had ruled a stretch of the galaxy for longer than humans had been building cities. They stood 8 feet tall on armored legs, with mandibles that could crush steel, and compound eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not even imagine. Their society ran on a rigid caste system controlled by hive queens, and at the very top sat the Supreme Overmind, a title that passed not through election or bloodline, but through superior intellect and cunning. Inheritance, but through combat. The current Overmind was called Zethkar, and he hated humans the way fire hates water. 3 systems rich in rare minerals had been the subject of a territorial dispute between humanity and the hegemony. The Galactic Concord had mediated and ruled in humanity's favor, and Zethkar had never forgiven the insult. To his species, territory was identity. To lose ground was to lose self, and he had sworn in the sacred chambers of Chithsera that the vermin from Sol would learn their place. Bakshi grabbed his comm unit and called Vasquez directly. She listened without interrupting, because that was her way, and when he finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, which was a long time for a woman who made decisions the way lightning made contact with the ground. "Send everything to my console," she said, "and flag it priority crimson." She studied the data herself because she trusted Bakshi, but she trusted her own eyes more. When she saw what he saw, she felt something cold settle into her bones. Not fear exactly, but the ghost of fear, the shadow it cast before it arrived. She contacted the Concord Observer on station, a reptilian diplomat named Talvek Suran, of the Suran Dominion. He was one of the few aliens she actually liked, polite and curious, and genuinely interested in human culture, in a galaxy where most elder species looked at humans the way a professor looks at a toddler who has wandered into a lecture hall. Talvek examined the data and waved a clawed hand in dismissal. The Velhari posture, he said. It is what insectoids do. They rattle their wings and flash their mandibles and then they go home. I have seen this 100 times, Commander. It is theater. Theater does not involve 200 warships, Vasquez replied. You are young as a species, Talvek said gently. You see danger in every shadow, because you have not yet learned which shadows are. Vasquez wanted to argue, but she had no authority to escalate beyond a local alert. Horizon's Edge was a colonial outpost, not a military installation. She had 2 frigates and a handful of orbital gun platforms, and a planetary shield that had been designed to stop meteor showers, not plasma bombardment. So she did what she could. She quietly moved the garrison to elevated readiness. She ordered the deep bunkers tested and the evacuation protocols reviewed. And she told no one else because she did not want to cause panic over what might be nothing. 1,000 light-years away, on the world called Chitsera, the supreme overmind Zethkar stood in the great chamber of the Hive Spire and addressed his war council. The room was vast and dark, and filled with the clicking of mandibles as 1,000 warrior caste commanders listened to their leader speak. The humans are vermin, Zethkar said, and his voice resonated through the chamber like the sound of stones, grinding together. They breed and spread and consume, and they have no history worth remembering, and no culture worth preserving, and no military worth fearing. They are children playing at civilization, and we will remind them of this truth. He laid out the plan with the cold precision of a surgeon, describing where to cut. 1 strike against 1 outpost, enough to draw blood, enough to send a message. The Galactic Concord would not intervene because the Concord never intervened for minor species, and humans were the most minor species of all. When the vermin see their dead, Zethkar continued, they will retreat to their little blue world, and they will stay there, and the stars will belong to those who deserve them. The War Council erupted in approval, mandibles clashing in the ancient rhythm of war song, and Zethkar felt the sweet warmth of certainty flood through his carapace. This would be simple. This would be clean. This would be over before the humans even understood what had happened. He had studied humans, of course, or he believed he had. He knew they were small and soft and fragile. He knew they lived brief lives and wept when those lives ended. He knew they wrote poetry and sang songs and held the hands of their dying, and he mistook all of this for weakness, because he came from a species that consumed its dead and considered grief a defect. He did not know about the unification wars. He did not know about the centuries of blood that had forged humanity into something harder than any species in the galaxy suspected. He did not know about the doctrine that Earth kept locked in its deepest vaults, the one that began with a single word, Omega. Back on Kepler 442b, the sun was setting through the biodome glass, and Commander Vasquez walked through the garden one last time before nightfall. She passed Maya Bakshi, who was 9 years old and drawing alien flowers in a sketchbook. The girl looked up and smiled, and Vasquez smiled back, because that is what you do when a child smiles at you, even when your gut is telling you something terrible is coming. She reached the edge of the garden and looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear, and she thought about how beautiful it all was, and how fragile. Then every alarm in the command center began to scream at once. The sensor officer's voice came through their earpiece, shaking and breathless, and carrying the weight of a world about to end. Commander, we have contacts, multiple fold space ruptures across the system. Count is still climbing, 200 plus and still rising. They are Velkari, and they are everywhere. Vasquez closed her eyes for one single heartbeat. Then she opened them and started running. The Velkari fleet filled the sky like a swarm of iron locusts, and the sight of it was enough to make a person forget how to breathe. 214 warships, arranged in perfect formation, their hulls black and angular, and covered in the bioluminescent markings of the warrior caste. each one bristling with plasma batteries and kinetic lances and torpedo bays that glowed like hungry mouths. And at the center of the formation sat the flagship of Supreme Overmind Zethkar, a massive dreadnought called the Chitin Throne that was larger than some moons. Zethkar broadcast his message on every frequency so that every soul on Kepler 442b could hear it. His voice was translated into human speech by machines, but the contempt needed no translation. Vacate this world or be exterminated. You have one solar rotation to comply. Commander Vasquez was already in the command center, barking orders when the message ended. She knew the ultimatum was a lie the moment she heard it. She heard it because she had studied the Velkari, and she understood that a species which considered mercy a weakness would never actually grant it. The deadline was theater, designed to make the massacre look justified in the eyes of the Concord. She was right. The fleet opened fire 9 minutes later. The first volley hit the northern orbital platform and turned it into a cloud of molten metal and screaming debris. The second volley struck the planetary shield, and the entire colony shuddered like a wounded animal as the barrier struggled to absorb energy it was never designed to handle. The third volley punched through. Vasquez had 9 minutes, and she used every second of them. She triggered the emergency distress signal aimed at Sol Command on Earth, a quantum burst transmission that would take hours to arrive, but would carry everything the sensor arrays had recorded. She activated the deep bunker protocols and ordered every civilian underground. Scrambled her 2 frigates, knowing full well that 2 ships against 200 was not a battle, but a statement. The ISV Defiant and the ISV Resolve launched from the surface docks and climbed into hell. Captain Marcus Webb commanded the Defiant, and he was the kind of man who had been born 1,000 years too late, or perhaps exactly on time. He flew his ship straight into the teeth of the Velkari formation, firing everything he had and scoring hits on 3 enemy cruisers before a concentrated barrage tore his port engine array apart and killed his weapons officer and shattered the forward hull. His ship was dying, and he knew it, and everyone on the bridge knew it, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of alarms and the hiss of escaping atmosphere. "Helm," Webb said quietly, "set collision course for their nearest carrier. All ahead full." The helmsman did not hesitate. The Defiant hit the Velkari carrier's spire of conquest at 3/4 of maximum thrust, and the explosion was visible from the surface of the planet. The carrier broke apart like an egg struck by a hammer, and 2 escort ships caught in the blast radius tumbled away in flames. On the bridge of the Chitin Throne, the tactical officer reported the loss, and for the first time in the battle, Zethkar felt something he did not recognize. It was not fear, but it was the cousin of fear, the quiet discomfort of encountering something that did not fit the model. A species facing certain defeat should surrender. That was the natural law of war. The weak yield to the strong. But these humans had just deliberately crashed a dying ship into his fleet, and the act made no tactical sense unless you understood something about humans that Zethkar did not. They would rather burn than kneel. On the surface, Commander Vasquez coordinated the ground-based railgun batteries with the calm focus of a conductor leading an orchestra through its final performance. The railguns were mining equipment repurposed for defense, and they were crude compared to Velkari weapons. But they threw slugs of depleted uranium at speeds that could crack starship armor, and Vasquez used them well. 11 Velkari ships fell to the ground batteries before the fleet adjusted its targeting and began systematically destroying every railgun emplacement on the planet. The bombardment was savage and precise, and it churned the surface into fire and ruin. In the research wing, Dr. Oren Bakshi was not a soldier, and he had never pretended to be one. But when the ceiling cracked and the lights went red, he ran not away from the danger, but toward the civilian shelters, because his daughter was there, and nothing in the universe mattered more than that. He found Maya in the shelter corridor, clutching her sketchbook, with wide, terrified eyes, and he dropped to his knees and held her face in his hands, and told her that everything was going to be okay, and that she needed to go into the deep bunker, and that he would be right behind her. He was lying, and some part of her knew it, but she nodded and let the evacuation team guide her down into the earth, where the walls were thick enough to survive what was coming. Bakshi turned back and ran toward the triage station, where wounded were already arriving, because he was a doctor as well as a linguist, and there were people who needed help, and he could not leave them. The research wing took the direct orbital strike 4 minutes later. The ceiling came down in a wall of fire and steel, and Dr. Oren Bakshi died in the same building where he had spent years trying to understand alien languages, because he believed that communication was the bridge between worlds. He never heard the last transmission of Commander Vasquez, but the galaxy did. She stood in the ruins of her command center, with blood running down her face and static crackling through the comms, and she opened a channel on every frequency, human and alien alike, and her voice was steady and clear and carried something in it that made even the Valkyrie translators pause. "This is Commander Lena Vasquez of the United Earth Colonial Forces. To the Valkyrie hegemony, you have made the last mistake your species will ever make. Earth remembers, and Earth responds. You killed our children today, and you celebrated, and you do not yet understand what you have done. But you will, I promise you, on the graves of every soul you have taken today, you will understand." The command center took a final hit, and the transmission ended, and Commander Lena Vasquez was gone. The bombardment continued for another 2 hours. The Valkyrie were thorough, because thoroughness was in their nature. And by the time they finished, the surface of Kepler 442b was scarred with craters and choked with smoke, and the colony that 12,000 people had called home was largely reduced to ash and rubble. The shattered ground, 783 people survived, most of them children, among them a 9-year-old girl clutching a sketchbook full of drawings of alien flowers and waiting for a father who would never come. Talvek Saran survived in his shielded diplomatic pod, and when the bombardment ended, he emerged into a landscape of devastation and stood in silence for a long time. He had seen wars before. His species was old, and its history was long. But there was something about this that cut deeper. Perhaps it was because he had known these people. Perhaps it was because he had told Vasquez the shadows were empty. He transmitted his report to the Galactic Concord, and knew even as he sent it that the bureaucrats would debate jurisdiction and procedure and protocol while the ashes cooled and the children wept. Across the galaxy, the news spread at the speed of light, and then faster, carried by gossip and rumor and the quiet networks of species who watched, waited. A human colony destroyed, 12,000 dead. A minor species taught its place. Some species nodded in approval. Some looked away in discomfort. Most simply noted it and moved on, because the galaxy was large, and atrocities were common, and humans were nobody important. On the world called Chitsera, Zethkar received the victory report, and his mandibles clicked in satisfaction, and the warrior caste sang songs of triumph in the ancient harmonics of their kind. They did not notice that a small quantum burst signal had reached Earth 7 hours after the battle began. They did not notice because it did not occur to them that it mattered. On Earth, the signal arrived at Sol Command and was routed to the United Earth Parliament, and every representative in the chamber listened to the sensor data and the casualty reports, and then they listened to the final transmission of Commander Lena Vasquez. And when her voice faded into static, the chamber was so quiet you could hear the heartbeat of a species deciding what it was going to become. The Speaker of the Parliament stood, and she was an old woman with white hair and steady hands, and she spoke a single sentence that had not been uttered since the darkest days of the Unification Wars. "I move to invoke the Omega Doctrine." The vote was unanimous. No debate was held. No abstentions were recorded. Every single representative of every single nation of Earth voted yes, and the chamber remained silent afterward, because there was nothing left to say. Somewhere deep beneath the surface of Earth, in vaults that did not officially exist, machines that had been sleeping for decades began to wake up. Earth went dark, and the galaxy held its breath without knowing why. It started small, a human trade vessel that failed to arrive at a scheduled port, a diplomatic office that closed without explanation, a communication relay that stopped transmitting, and within 72 hours, every human presence in the galaxy had simply vanished like smoke pulled back into a fire. Embassies were emptied overnight, their staff gone, and their doors sealed, and their systems wiped clean. Trade routes that had carried human goods for decades went silent. Ships that had been docked at alien stations undocked and flew into the black and did not come back. And the humans who had lived and worked among other species for years packed their bags and said nothing, and left. The galaxy noticed, and the galaxy talked. In the trading halls of the Saran Dominion, the merchants muttered that the humans were cowering, retreating to their little blue world to lick their wounds, like the insignificant creatures they were. In the council chambers of the Velkari hegemony, the warrior caste laughed and said that the vermin had learned their lesson. In the bars and bazaars of 100 alien stations, the consensus formed quickly and comfortably. Humans were weak, and the strong had spoken, and that was the natural order of things. But not everyone was laughing. The Lithane were a silicon-based species older than most stars. They had watched civilizations rise and fall, the way humans watch seasons change. They spoke rarely, and when they spoke, the galaxy listened. And 3 days after humanity went dark, a Lithane elder transmitted a single message to the Galactic Concord. We have seen this pattern before. When a species of warriors goes quiet, it does not mean they have accepted defeat. It means they are preparing something that will change the shape of what comes after. We advise caution. The Concord received the message, and filed it, and continued, debating whether the attack on Kepler 442b constituted a violation of galactic law or a legitimate territorial action. They sent 14 messages to Earth requesting dialogue. Earth did not respond to a single one. Inside the Sol system, something extraordinary was happening. The Omega Doctrine was not a battle plan. It was a transformation. It was the moment a civilization of artists and scientists and dreamers remembered that it was also a civilization of warriors, and it reached deep into itself and pulled out something terrible and beautiful and unstoppable. Every shipyard in human space pivoted to war production in a matter of days. Civilian freighters were recalled and refitted with armor plating and weapon systems. Mining vessels were converted into ammunition carriers. Luxury liners became hospital ships. And the great orbital construction platforms above Earth and Mars and Titan that had been building colony ships began building something very different. Fleet Admiral Kaito Mori stood at the center of it all, like the calm eye of a hurricane. He was 63 years old, with silver hair cropped close to his skull, and eyes that held the quiet intensity of a man who had spent his entire life thinking about war so that he could prevent it. He was the descendant of a military lineage that stretched back centuries, samurai and soldiers and strategists, and he carried the weight of that lineage in his posture and his precision, and his absolute refusal to waste a single word or a single life without purpose. He had been appointed Supreme Commander of the United Earth Navy 6 years ago, and in all that time he had never raised his voice. His officers said that the quieter Admiral Mori became, the more dangerous things were about to get. And right now, he was very quiet indeed. He convened his command staff aboard the flagship ENS Prometheus, a dreadnought-class vessel that was the largest warship humanity had ever built, and he laid out the plan with the clean efficiency of a man who had already considered every variable and discarded every option that did not lead to absolute certainty. "We will not engage the Valkyrie fleet," he said, and the room went still, because every officer present had expected a fleet engagement. "We will not fight a war of attrition. We will not trade systems, or negotiate ceasefires, or play the game the way the galaxy expects us to play it." He activated the holographic display, and the blue-white sphere of a planet appeared at the center of the room. It was Chithsera, the Valkyrie homeworld. "We are going to end this in one action," Mori continued. "We are going to take their homeworld off the map." The silence that followed was not the silence of agreement, but the silence of people trying to process something too large to fit inside their understanding. A junior officer near the back of the room spoke first, and his voice cracked as he said, "Admiral, that is a civilian world. Billions of Valkyrie live there. Hive queens and workers and larvae and scholars. This would be the largest military action against a civilian population in recorded galactic history." Mori looked at the young officer, and his expression did not change, and his voice did not waver. 12,000 civilians lived on Kepler 442b, he said. Men and women and children. 9-year-old girls who drew pictures of flowers. The Valkyrie made the rules of engagement when they fired on that colony. We are simply going to honor those rules at a scale they did not anticipate. Director Ava Chen entered the briefing room like a shadow given purpose. She was the head of AGIS, which stood for Advanced Exostrategic Galactic Intelligence Service, the most secret organization in human space. She was small and sharp, and her eyes missed nothing. She had been running intelligence operations in alien space for 20 years. Operations so deep and so quiet that most of the human government did not know they existed. "The Valkyrie fleet is dispersed across their territory," Shen reported. "They are running victory parades and celebration rituals, and their homeworld defense grid is at peacetime readiness. They have a skeleton garrison of 40 ships, and their planetary shield network has a maintenance cycle that creates a vulnerability window every 9 days." She paused and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. "Additionally, our embedded assets have been inside their shield control systems for the past 18 months. When the time comes, those shields will not function." The room absorbed this, and the weight of it settled over everyone present like a physical thing, because they were beginning to understand that this had not been planned in the days since Kepler 442b. This capability had been built over years. Humanity had been preparing for a war that it hoped would never come. Had always known might. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, Talvek Suran had reached Concord headquarters and was trying desperately to make someone listen. He stood before the Grand Assembly and told them what he had seen on Kepler 442b. The broken buildings and the burning sky and the children pulled from rubble. And then he told them what he feared was coming. "You do not understand humans," he said, and his voice carried a tremor that surprised even him. "I lived among them and I thought I understood them, and I was wrong. They are not what they appear to be. They smile, and they write poetry, and they build gardens on alien worlds, and all of this is true. But underneath all of it is something else. Something very old and very patient and very dangerous." He looked around the assembly chamber at the representatives of 100 species who had ruled the galaxy for millennia, and who could not imagine that a species barely 3 centuries into space travel could threaten any of. "They have gone silent," Talvek said. "And I am telling you that silence is the most terrifying sound in the galaxy right now. You need to act. Not to protect the Valkyrie, but to protect the order that holds civilization together. Because if the humans do what I think they are going to do, nothing will ever be the same." The Concord thanked him for his testimony, and formed a committee to investigate and scheduled a preliminary hearing for the following month. In dark space, beyond the edge of known Valkyrie territory, far from any sensor array or patrol route, the ships began to gather. They came from every corner of human space, frigates and destroyers and cruisers and carriers and dreadnoughts. They came from Earth and Mars and Titan and Alpha Centauri and Tau Ceti and Kepler, and Proxima, and a dozen other systems. They came in silence, with their transponders dark, and their engines running cold, and they assembled in the void, like wolves gathering at the edge of a forest. 4,112 warships, the entire United Earth Navy, plus every armed vessel that could be pressed into service, the largest fleet ever assembled by any species in the recorded history of the galaxy. Admiral Maury stood on the bridge of the Prometheus and looked at the tactical display, where thousands of blue dots hung in the darkness like a constellation that had decided to move, and he opened a fleet-wide channel. And when he spoke, his voice was carried to every ship and every crew member and every soul who had volunteered to be part of what was about to happen. 3 weeks ago, the Velkari hegemony attacked a human colony and murdered 12,000 of our people. They did this because they believed we were weak. They did this because they believed there would be no consequences. Today, we are going to teach the galaxy a lesson it will never forget. Not with words, not with treaties, not with diplomacy, with consequences. Paused for one breath. All ships, engage fold space drives, destination Kithsera. 4,000 ships vanished from dark space in a ripple of light that no one saw, and the void was empty again, and silent, and waiting. The sky above Kithsera split open like a wound, and the stars bled ships. They came out of fold space in a wave that stretched across the entire orbital plane. 4,000 warships emerging simultaneously in a synchronized arrival so precise that the Velkari sensor operators thought their equipment was malfunctioning. No fleet in galactic history had ever executed a fold space jump with that kind of coordination. It was supposed to be impossible. The margin of error should have scattered them across light minutes of space. But the human navigators had calculated the jump to within meters, and the fleet arrived as a single fist. The Velkari Homeworld Defense Force consisted of 42 warships and a network of orbital weapons platforms. They were commanded by a veteran named Krixtal, who had never lost a battle, and who took exactly 3 seconds to assess the situation on his tactical display, before he understood with perfect clarity that he was about to lose his last one. He ordered his ships into defensive formation anyway, because duty was the only religion the warrior caste believed in, and he opened fire on the approaching human fleet, and his plasma battery struck the forward shields of the ENS Prometheus and did absolutely nothing. The battle for orbital control lasted 11 minutes. Human electronic warfare systems activated across every frequency the Velkari used for communication and coordination. These systems were built on principles that no other species in the galaxy had developed, because no other species had spent its entire history fighting itself and refining the art of war against an enemy that thought exactly like it did. The Velkari found their tactical networks dissolving, their targeting solutions corrupted, their ships unable to coordinate, and in the confusion, the human fleet cut through them with surgical precision. Krixtal's flagship was the last to fall. He fought until his bridge was burning, and his crew was dead, and his ship was breaking apart around him, and his final act was to aim his dying vessel at the nearest human dreadnought in a desperate ramming attempt. The humans saw it coming, and 2 frigates intercepted and destroyed his ship before it could connect. But Admiral Maury noted the act and quietly ordered that when the histories were written, the Velkari commander's courage would be recorded with respect. Then the human fleet turned its attention to the planet below. On the surface of Kithsera, Supreme Overmind Zethkar was in the great chamber of the Hive Spire when the first reports came in. He ordered an emergency distress signal sent to every Velkari fleet in the hegemony, and watched as his communication officers tried and failed and tried again. Nothing was getting through. The humans had wrapped the entire star system in an electronic shroud so dense that not a single transmission could escape. He ordered the planetary shields activated, and stood in rigid confidence as the shield operators engaged the system. And then he watched that confidence shatter as the shields flickered once and died. The Human Intelligence Agency, Aegis, had planted code in the SHIELD network 18 months ago. Sleeper programs that had waited patiently in the system architecture like parasites in the blood of a host. And now they woke and did what they were designed to do. For the first time in his life, Supreme Overmind Zethkar felt his thorax contract with something he had no name for, because his species had bred it out of their warrior caste 10,000 years ago. It was fear, and it tasted like copper and ash. A transmission cut through the electronic silence on every frequency in every Velkari dialect simultaneously. The voice was human and male and calm, and it carried the weight of something final. This is Fleet Admiral Kaido Mori of the United Earth Navy. 3 weeks ago, your forces attacked a human colony on Kepler 442b and murdered 12,000 men, women, and children. You gave them 9 minutes between your ultimatum and your first shot. I am giving you 6 standard hours. Evacuate who you can. The message repeated on loop, and it was the most terrifying thing Zethkar had ever heard. Not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. The humans were not here to negotiate. They were not here to posture. They were not here to take hostages or demand concessions. They were here to destroy his world, and they were giving him time to save some of his people first. And somehow that mercy was more frightening than any cruelty. Chaos erupted across Chitsera. Billions of Velkari scrambled for transport ships and evacuation shuttles and cargo haulers and anything with an engine and a hull. The great hive cities that had stood for millennia descended into panic, as workers and drones and queens and larvae fought for places on departing vessels. The human fleet held position and waited. Every evacuation ship that launched from the surface was scanned and tracked and allowed to pass through the fleet cordon unharmed. Human frigates even adjusted their positions to create clear flight corridors for the fleeing Velkari. And this act of organized mercy in the shadow of organized destruction was something the galaxy had never seen before and did not know how to understand. Some Velkari warships that had been docked at orbital stations tried to fight, and the human fleet destroyed them with the casual efficiency of a giant swatting insects. And the irony of that comparison was lost on no one. 6 hours passed. They passed slowly for the Velkari, and they passed slowly for the humans, because waiting to do a terrible thing is its own kind of suffering. On the bridge of the Prometheus, Admiral Mori stood with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the evacuation reports scroll across his display. Millions had escaped. Millions more had not. And the math of it was the kind of thing that would live in his chest for the rest of his life. The clock reached 0, and Mori closed his eyes for 3 seconds, and when he opened them his voice was steady. All ships, commence bombardment. The weapons that humanity unleashed on Chitsera were things the galaxy did not know existed. Kinetic lances fired tungsten rods, the size of buildings, at velocities that approached a significant fraction of the speed of light. When these rods struck the surface, they did not simply explode. They converted their kinetic energy into devastation on a scale that made nuclear weapons look like firecrackers. Each impact was an earthquake and a firestorm and a crater miles wide. Solar disruptors targeted the system's star and destabilized its corona, producing targeted flares that washed across the planet in waves of radiation that sterilized everything they touched. And between these apocalyptic weapons, the conventional arsenal rained down, nuclear warheads and plasma bombs and incendiary payloads that filled the spaces between the larger impacts with fire and ruin. Chitsera died the way a candle dies when you close your fist around it. The great hive spires that had stood for 10,000 years and housed billions of souls collapsed into dust. The oceans boiled away in clouds of steam that rose miles into the atmosphere before the atmosphere itself caught fire. The underground networks that connected the hive cities crumbled as the crust above them turned to magma. And the world that had been the heart and soul and memory of the Velkari hegemony became a blackened sphere of glass and ash and silence. In his command bunker deep beneath the hive spire, Zethkar felt the ceiling begin to glow red as the rock above him liquefied. He had refused to evacuate because an overmind does not flee, and in his final moments he understood with terrible clarity that he had been wrong about everything. The humans were not vermin. They were not weak. They were not children playing at civilization. They were something far more dangerous than anything he had imagined. They were a species that loved so fiercely that when you hurt them, they would burn a world to make sure you could never do it again. The molten rock reached him, and his last thought was that he should have listened to the shadows. From across the galaxy, every species with deep space sensors watched the data feeds in real time. They watched the energy signatures and the thermal blooms and the gravitational fluctuations that told the story of a world being murdered. And the watchers did not speak because there were no words in any language that fit the shape of what they were seeing. In the Galactic Concord Assembly Chamber, the representatives sat in their seats and stared at their displays, and the chamber was as silent as it had ever been in its million-year history. The committee that had been formed to investigate the Kepler 442b incident held an emergency session and then dissolved itself because there was nothing left to investigate. Talvek Saran watched from the observation gallery, and tears ran down his scaled face, not for the Valkyrie, because the Valkyrie had earned what they received, but for the galaxy. Because the order that had held civilization together for millennia had just been rewritten in fire, and the author was a species that most of the galaxy had dismissed as irrelevant. The human fleet remained in orbit around the dead world, and when the bombardment was complete, they deployed a permanent sensor buoy that would orbit Chithsera for as long as machines could endure. The buoy broadcast a single message on every known galactic frequency, in every known language, on an endless loop. Kepler 442b is remembered. The Valkyrie who had escaped, the millions on evacuation ships, and the billions on colony worlds, watched from across space as their homeworld burned, and they understood that everything they were was gone. Their queen lineages were broken, their genetic repositories were ash, their cultural archives were vapor. Their history lived now only in the memories of the survivors, and memories fade, and in a few generations, even those would be gone. They were not extinct, but they were something worse. They were unmoored, a species without a center, and the grief of it would define them for centuries. The Lithane elder who had warned the Concord broke a millennia-long public silence to issue a single statement that was transmitted to every civilization in the galaxy. Noted. And in that single word was everything: acknowledgement and warning and respect and fear, and the recognition that the galaxy had a new apex predator, and it walked on two legs and wrote poetry and loved its children and was capable of things that made the oldest species in creation pause, turned and began the long journey home. And behind them the dead world glowed like an ember in the dark, and the boys sang its endless song to the stars. Kepler 442b is remembered. Kepler 442b is remembered. Kepler 442b is remembered. 6 months after the fall of Chithsera, the galaxy was still learning how to be afraid. It was a new feeling for most species. The elder civilizations had not experienced genuine fear in millennia because the galactic order had been stable for so long that stability itself had become invisible, like gravity, like the expansion of the universe, like the assumption that the strong would always dominate the weak, and the weak would always accept it. But now the order had a crack running through it, and the crack was shaped like a species that nobody had taken seriously until it was far too late. The Valkyrie hegemony existed in name only. Refugee fleets drifted between star systems, carrying millions of displaced survivors who had nothing left but their lives and the memory of a world that no longer existed. Some species offered sanctuary because compassion was not entirely dead in the galaxy. The Sauron Dominion opened 3 colony worlds to Velkari refugees and the small, mammalian species called the Fenari, who had once been bullied by the hegemony, surprised everyone by being the first to send aid ships. Many others turned the refugees away, not out of cruelty, but out of fear, because harboring the species that had provoked humanity felt like standing next to a lightning rod in a storm. On the scattered colony worlds, where Velkari still held territory, the subhives fractured and fought each other for control, because the queen lineage system that had held their civilization together for 10,000 years had been centered on Shithsera, and without it, they were branches cut from a tree, still alive, but slowly dying. And the civil conflicts that erupted were savage and petty and heartbreaking, in the way that the death throes of any great civilization are heartbreaking, regardless of what that civilization had done. Earth watched and said nothing, because Earth had made its point and did not need to make it again. Ambassador Yuki Tanaka arrived at the Galactic Concord aboard a diplomatic vessel called the ISV Olive Branch, and the name was chosen deliberately because humans understood symbolism in ways that most alien species found either charming or unnerving. She was a small woman with black hair streaked silver and eyes that held warmth and steel in equal measure. She had been a negotiator in the Unification Wars, and she had brokered peace between nations that had been killing each other for centuries. And she approached the galactic stage with the same patient ferocity. She carried a single document. It was called the Sol Accords, and it was 17 pages long, and written in language so clear and precise that it could not be misinterpreted or twisted or buried in committee. Its terms were simple. First, that sovereign species were inviolable, and that unprovoked attacks on civilian populations would trigger automatic collective response from all signatories. Second, that territorial disputes would be resolved through binding arbitration with consequences for non-compliance. Third, that a rapid response military force would be established to enforce these principles, and that humanity would serve as the primary contributor and enforcer of last resort. The Concord Assembly erupted in reaction. Some species were outraged at the audacity of a species barely 3 centuries old dictating terms to civilizations that had been ancient when humans were still living in caves. The Drakith ambassador called it imperialism wrapped in righteousness, and demanded that humanity be sanctioned for the destruction of Chithsera. But others were quieter and more thoughtful, and they looked at the empty chair where the Velkari representative used to sit, and they thought about what had happened and why, and they realized that the Concord had failed. It had failed to prevent the attack on Kepler 442b, and it had failed to respond to the massacre, and it had failed to act when Talvek had begged them to intervene. And the result of all that failure was a dead world and a broken species, and a galaxy that now lived in the shadow of human wrath. The Lithane cast their vote first, as they always did, because seniority had its privileges, and their vote was in favor, and the weight of it silenced the chamber, because when the oldest species in creation endorsed something, the wise paid attention. The Sol Accords passed by a margin of 3-1, and the galaxy had a new framework and a new enforcer, and nothing would ever be the same. On Kepler 442b, reconstruction had begun. The first ships arrived 2 months after the fall, carrying engineers and builders and architects, and they landed on scarred Earth and began the slow work of resurrection. The deep bunkers were opened, and the survivors emerged blinking into sunlight that fell on a changed world. The biodome garden was gone, and the research wing was a basal crater, and the command center, where Vasquez had made her last stand, was a twisted skeleton of metal and memory. They built a memorial at the center of the old colony, a wall of black granite that rose 30 feet from the ground and curved in a gentle arc, like a pair of arms reaching out to hold something precious. Inscribed on its surface were the names of every soul who had died, 11,217 names, carved in letters that would endure for centuries. Maya Bakshi came back with the first wave of returning colonists. She was 10 years old now, and she had spent 6 months on Earth, in a home that was not her home, surrounded by people who were kind, but who were not her father. And she had learned something in those months that no 10-year-old should have to learn. That the universe is not fair, and that the people you love can be taken from you without warning, and that the only thing you can do about it is decide what kind of person you are going to be. In the aftermath, she walked to the memorial wall and found her father's name, and she placed her hand against the cool stone and stood there for a long time. And she did not cry because she had done all her crying already. And what she felt now was something beyond tears, something quiet and heavy and permanent that would live in her chest for the rest of her life. She had brought her sketchbook, the same one she had been clutching when the bombs fell, and she opened it to the last drawing she had made before the attack, a sun blossom with petals like honey-colored glass, and she held it up against the wall next to her father's name, and whispered something that the wind carried away before anyone else could hear. Talvik Suran was reassigned as the Galactic Concorde's permanent liaison to Earth, and he took the posting with a mixture of honor and dread. He had come to respect humans in the way that a person respects a river, beautiful and life-giving and capable of drowning you without malice if you failed to respect its power. In a private meeting with Ambassador Tanaka, he asked the question that had been eating at him since the day the sky above Chitsera turned to fire. Was it worth it, he said? The billions on Chitsera, the children in their hive nurseries, the scholars in their libraries, the workers who had never held a weapon. Was it worth it? Tanaka was quiet for a long time, and Talvik could see that the question was not new to her, that she had asked it of herself many times in the dark hours when sleep would not come. Ask me that question again in 100 years, she said finally. If no one else has attacked a human outpost by then, you will have your answer. Talvik nodded slowly, because he understood what she was saying, even if he was not sure he agreed. She was saying that the morality of the act could only be measured by its consequences, that if the destruction of Chitsera prevented 1,000 future Kepler 442b's, then the math was justified even if the soul was bruised. And he thought that this was a very human way of looking at the universe, pragmatic and brutal and honest. Fleet Admiral Kaito Mori retired from service 3 weeks after the fleet returned to Earth. There was no ceremony because he refused one, and no medals because he refused those too. He went home to Kyoto, where his family had lived for generations, and he tended a small garden in the courtyard of a house that was older than space travel. A reporter found him there one morning, pulling weeds from between rows of vegetables, and asked him if he had any regrets about what he had done. Mori straightened and looked at the reporter with those quiet eyes that had commanded the largest fleet in galactic history, and he said, "Every single day, that is how I know I am still human." Then he went back to his garden because the tomatoes needed water, and the war was over, and life insisted on continuing, even when the weight of what you had done pressed down on you like the gravity of a dead world. Director Ava Chen did not retire. She expanded Aegis operations across every major civilization in the galaxy. Human intelligence assets were embedded in governments and militaries and communication networks so deeply that they would never be found. Not because humanity wanted to spy on its neighbors, but because humanity never wanted to be caught off guard again. Never wanted another Kepler 442b. Never wanted another morning where the alarms screamed, and there was nothing to be done but die bravely. She worked in the shadows, and she slept lightly, and she kept her secrets, and the galaxy was safer for it, even if the galaxy would never know. Years passed, and the soul accords held, and no one attacked a human colony. No one attacked anyone's colony. Because the lesson of Chitsera was written in a language that every species could understand, regardless of biology or culture or history. The language of consequences. And then one day, a delegation arrived at the Galactic Concord, a small species newly spacefaring, insectoid coincidentally, nervous and wide-eyed and overwhelmed by the vastness of the galaxy they had just entered. They were directed to the human embassy first, as all new species now were, because that was the protocol under the Accords. The young alien ambassador stood in the lobby of the embassy and looked around at the artwork on the walls, which depicted Earth in all its seasons, and at the small fountain in the corner that made a sound like rain, and at the humans who walked past, smiling and nodding. And then the ambassador turned to the human attaché who had been assigned to welcome them, a young woman with kind eyes and brown skin, and a name tag that read Lieutenant Priya Singh. "Is it true what they say about your species?" the ambassador asked, and there was a tremor in the translator's rendering of the words. "The stories about what you did to the Velkari, are they true?" Lieutenant Singh looked at the young alien, and she saw the fear there, plain and undisguised, and she felt something twist in her heart. Because this is not what she wanted First Contact to look like. She did not want to be the monster in someone else's story. She smiled, and it was a real smile, warm and open, and full of the thing that made humans dangerous and beautiful in equal measure, the capacity to care. "We are not what the stories say," she said gently. "We are your neighbors, and we protect our neighbors." She extended her hand, and the alien ambassador looked at it for a moment, not understanding the gesture, and then reached out with a trembling limb and took it. Behind them, through the embassy window, the stars burned cold and bright in the endless dark, and among them somewhere was a dead world orbited by a machine that sang the same words over and over, and would keep singing them until the stars themselves burned out. And the galaxy, which had learned many words over its long history, had learned a new one, a human word, small and simple and heavy with meaning: consequences. It was a word the galaxy would not forget.